James keep reminding me African Digital Humanities. And the two of them inspire and they still continue to inspire my own thinking. Most importantly, know that these figures are not important. I want to thank those of you who might be listening or watching this event for your time. I'm flattered to see that you rather be listening to me than eat a plate of jollof rice, for example. So thank you very much. So now back to business. What I'm going to be doing today is not a straightforward academic presentation, because this is not a straightforward academic workshop, a straightforward academic conference. It is a workshop. I'm conscious of the need to engage and stimulate the interest of the listening public in a digital workshop like this one. I think a way to hold your attention or the attention of the public is to put together my own reflections on the book, with the hope that these reflections, which I must warn you may seem fragmented, can lead to a substantive conversation at the end. Books, as you know, have many stories behind them. Stories that preceded their conception, stories that emerged during their conceptions, stories during the process of publications, and post-publication stories. So books, in whichever format we are talking about or we're talking of, be it digital or print, are made out of story, and they also tell stories. As Africans, as Africanists, as students of African studies and those who indulge in digital culture, we know that stories are the stuff of theory. Stories theorize, and we can theorize through them. The story behind African literature in the digital age are multifaceted in nature. There is no linear structure to them. The book, as those of you who've read it may have seen, can be divided into three parts. That's the class part, the sexuality part, and the little bit parts toward the end, which are called the quotidian. Which is the quotidian? The quotidian, I use the quotidian to interrogate the notion of class and the notion of sexuality in the African digital context. In the book, I was trying as much as possible not to create a distinction between the world of orality and the world of the digital. The digital in the African context, the text in the African context, you say, is a continuum, and the digital in the African context is also a continuum. Text is sung, written, spoken, and dance. And the text is not limited by technologies, because the African text, if I may say, use that, those two words, transverses technologies. The African text transverses time. The act of theorizing should not necessarily dwell in the realm of linearity, in the realm of duality and the formulaic module of Western aesthetics. Theorizing and philosophizing come in all sorts of multiple methods. And what I was conscious of is to try as much as possible not to go along this grain of Eurocentric concept of the objective bystander. The scholar, in my view, has to get involved by indulging in some dose of digital ethnography. In the course of my research for the book, I joined listserv and social media groups and took part in some of the conversations. So what African literature and the digital age has done is to follow a pattern of thinking that approaches African digital culture from African-centric viewpoint. I did, however, maintain some elusiveness in my interaction with writers, some of whom became my friends or have become my friends along the way. As scholars of African descent, writing about our people, we are fighting war on two fronts: against the old Western aesthetics that dwells in the realm of beauty versus ugliness, and against a style of writing that is full of jargons, that relies on quoting and reaffirming dead men of European descent. We're also writing against a style of writing that one can describe as a pose of meek, fake, cultured objectivity and its pale beige tone. The style of writing that has turned its back on the fertile fields of clarity that is the foundation of the spoken word, and instead going for obscurity. So I'm going to start with this idea of class. I've always been fascinated by the idea of class and social status, and the way in which these elements dwell within the terrain of Euro-modernity. So we're talking about traditions as well, and also of African notion of modernity. A starting point for me is the close link between genre and class, so art and class. Each social class often tries to define itself by devising and utilizing arts that truly capture the very essence of its existence, but also because various elements of day-to-day experiences are often portrayed through the prisms of one's own class. And one of the key point I made, which in my own view anyway, is that class consciousness is not alien to many African societies. Class also intersects economic and cultural strata, and no one epitomizes this phenomenon more than the writer, whether you're talking about the Nigerian writer or the Kenyan writer, whose work were the objects of analysis in the book. The ideas about social status that one sees in oral African texts problematize the idea of social classes that seems to mimic that of the West. What I was trying to resolve in this book was the complicated nature of the social classes as seen online, as seen in digital communities. For example, I'm also aware that there are rich traders in Lagos and Nairobi who might not be highly educated, but come from families of wealth and property many generations down the line. They use the internet regularly and trade in mobile money every day, so in Pesa, for example. On the other hand, we have school teachers in these cities who are living on the breadline, who may not even be able to afford the same access to the internet. How do we categorize these people in terms of class? And literature also speaks to this as well. This is the dilemma of applying Marxist concept or Adam Smith's idea of class with regards to the continent of Africa. There are conjunctions, historical and contemporary, that one must negotiate. And this is what I did with regards to this book, which also I'm still trying to resolve as well. Mass is definitely not enough. We need also to turn to oral culture and oral history. We must be endlessly in culture, continuously returning to culture, continuously speaking and conversing with, especially with oral culture. So now, and if you notice then, after the introductions, the very first chapter look at literary networks. And what I want us to think is the way in which literary networks can be linked to the idea of class, also the idea of modernity, actually what I term as digital modernity towards the end of the book. In the 21st century, the notion of digital modernity speaks to the view that those who are on social media every day are people versed in a new lingua franca, the language of the digital space, which is different from what we use in the analog age. They socialize not only through the written words, but also express themselves through emoticons, emoji, GIFs, images, and instant videos. They form small and big literary networks in digital communities and in offline physical space. Their socialization is based on shared class interests in literature and the arts. For example, there are book clubs based in Lagos, Nairobi, Port Harcourt, and so on and so forth. And these book clubs are also, they also maintain active presence on Instagram and on Facebook. In both Nigeria and Kenya, literary networks provide a means to analyze the way in which a reading culture emerged to create a new public that was mainly composed of those who could read and write. It gives us an opportunity to investigate the way in which print culture and digital culture not only produce new artistic genres, but also how they produce new and competing ideas about what it is to be an African. Ideas about civilization, ideas about progress, and ideas about modernity. The literary histories of both countries can therefore be best understood if you want to study the workings of the people who form the circle of writers, the publishers, readers, and even politicians. This is because literature expresses not only the worldview of those who constitute a literary circle, but also carries the exigency of the society from which they emanate from where these people come from in the first place. In a way, literary network are small worlds. Then another big chunk, which is also very important, and it's not, probably the most important aspect, because it speaks to the idea of class as well, is that of sexuality. Here again, I approach it from an African-centric perspective. First, the book challenges this notion that in Nigeria and Kenya, we have always lived in a world of binary, the good versus the bad. Here, I'm thinking about the way in which the sexually explicit and the profane are seen as the exact opposite of the sacred and the spiritual. Again, I drew upon my own Yoruba tradition in looking at the explicitness and the graphicness of sex that one may encounter in the work of writers. For example, in the work of writers like Kirutaye or Joyce Ibewaji. Or also, I'm arguing against this notion that there's nothing African about the confidence with which these African women create their characters. Well, those are my children, you can hear in the background, so apologies for that. Or talk about their own private sexual lives on social media platforms. What really characterizes the discussions of sexuality in the book is the insistence that current discourse on African sexuality is heavily impacted by the project of colonial modernity. In chapter 6, for example, I argue that the starting point is that over the course of a century, of more than a century, discourses around the figure of the modern girl about sexual deviances and the middle class writers and middle class readers are central to this narrative. I argue that times like Ashewo in Nigeria, which is Yoruba for money changer, and Malaya in Kenya, lump together women who do not conform to contemporary sexual norms. A woman referred to as Ashewo could be a medical doctor who likes sex or who is sexually confident. While at the same time, a sex worker is also categorized as Ashewo. So when you look at the writing, for example, literature that was published, print work that was published in 1929 in Nigeria called by I.B. Thomas, entitled Itambese Emiaye Shegilola, and then compare that to what was published 80 years later on a Facebook page, the Facebook post as a short story, Ashewo Anonymous. We see that this narrative, there's a continuum between, there's a link between this narrative. The story seeming to be reflecting the same ideas about female sexuality. And I use this conflation to analyze the sexual market and how the figure of the Ashewo, the figure of the sex worker challenges some of the dominant assumptions relating to the libidinal economy in Africa. Then that's about female sexuality, just briefly anyway. Then I also talk about queer sexuality. Although violence is highly prevalent in the lives of queer Africans, what I was trying to do in African literature and indigenous is to question why this violence is portrayed in a certain way and in certain ways within fictional narrative. The question I was trying to address is the violence merely a means to an end used as a tool by homophobic and heteronormative government and foreign missionaries to promote the idea that queerness on Africa is un-African? Or is it an authentic portrayal based on the suffering of real queer people communicating within a digital community or interacting within a digital community? How does Euro-Christian modernity contribute to the violence constantly inflicted on the bodies of queer Africans? That, these are sort of things as part of the images that one often encounters in writing on digital platform. These factors are important to note when comparing works of fictional narrative in the digital platform, because it is the reason behind the violence that is apparent to the audience, and so the ulterior motive behind creative works need to be considered to accurately understand what the message is. Since coexistence are multiplicitous, it needs to be noted where exactly this notion of violence are coming from and how they are portrayed within the world, within digital space, and to clearly understand the implicit message behind these works of literature. Yeah, lastly, I'm going to move on to the quotidian. And as I said at the beginning, I use the quotidian to interrogate the discourse of sexuality and the discourse of class by thinking with the ordinary and the everyday within the digital space. And this comes out of my own conviction that the unspectacular is the foundation of great works of art. And these are some of the points I was trying to make in that regard. Number one, that the neglect of the quotidian, the ordinary, in a lot of work that in African literary studies, I'm going to repeat that again. The neglect of the quotidian is due to a taking for granted belief that the realm of everyday is the site of common sense and commonplace, well known, even trivial. Also, I believe that scholars often privilege the spectacular over the ordinary and the routine. Also, all too often, African narrative comes with all kinds of spectacular stereotypes. So we have the Maasai, the flesh-eating dictators, the hungry children. So which, it seems to be, when we talk about Africa, the image of the spectacular seems not to be too far off. And so we fail to see how the everyday constitutes a starting point for thinking about these life-changing, spectacular moments that we tend to encounter in the media, that we tend to encounter even in what is being published by African writers and African publishers. Also, we fail to see how the process of living every day, reflect structures of marginalization, structure of power, interpersonal and intergroup relationship. And lastly, every day is deemed as an unreliable source of knowledge about regularities in human behavior and society. With over 1 billion people using social media network every day, the quotidian matters because platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are sites that archive everyday human experience. For many Africans, the mobile phone is an everyday, ubiquitous, functional tool that people use to access social media as part of everyday engagement with politics, with literature, and with the world. Those who partake in this digital conversation that take place every second of every day are doing so as participants in digital modernity. The idea of modernity tethers us to newness and progress, and newness and progress rely on everyday engagement across digital platforms. Every day on social media constitutes a teachable moment and provide new chance to become aware of things that we take for granted and the idea that we dismiss as insignificant, which, however, as someone else's everyday reality. And I was, just to conclude, what I was trying to point us to, and with the hope that other scholars who might want to see the quotidian, the ordinary, as a starting point to think about work of art, especially what is being produced in the digital space. So I'm going to stop now. There's a lot of fragmentation, as I said, but I hope that this is making, will stimulate some conversations as we go along. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
It appears you might be muted, Grace. Not yet. So Grace is getting another earpiece, and while we wait for, I wonder if Kwabena wants to jump in and say one or two things. Kwabena has a very fascinating review of Adenekan's book at the Journal of African Literature Association, and I think that was published just some few weeks ago. So while we wait for Dr. Musila to be back, it could just be a point of conversation if you both want to go in that direction. Trying to find Kwabena on the screen.
I think Kwabena may have left as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I could ask you a question while we wait for Grace. I like it when you refer to those emojis and GIFs as symbolic expressions of the quotidian on social media. And I just wonder to what extent these communicative forms online are also implicated in the politics of resistance that seems to be common in many online spaces in the African context. I hope that makes sense.
I mean, of course, emoticons, GIFs are also a sort of like subtle form of resistance, as well as overtly form of resistance as well. If you go and look at politicians' political website or social media pages run by politicians, you will see and you notice the people's response, maybe on Twitter. Emoticons are used as a form of subversive disagreement, it's a form of subversive questioning of politics. And also with writers, if you look at the controversy over what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said recently, and the ongoing controversy, which I don't want to talk about because of the case of, because you see within the terrain of legal distance. You could see that emoticons and GIFs are used by people as a way of querying, of asking questions without actually voicing. So they provide a voice, and they are alternative voices in speaking and in communicating. And it's quite interesting as well that those who partake in this sort of conversation understand the implicit meanings behind them. They know how to interpret them. And conversation also ensued from their posting. And in my view, I think these constitute another avenue for us to theorize about the outspoken. What is not focalized, but is given representation in a digital form.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating, especially when you think about, what you could call the ontological visuality of social media. It's essentially a visual platform, and you focus on the literary rather than the visual. And I wonder really to what extent there are notes of connections between both. But we can leave that and talk about that later. I don't want to preempt the kind of interventions Grace might want to make. Something else that comes to mind, and a lot of people tend to ask me this when when we discuss your work and other work in the literary digital humanities out there, the question is always about the judgment of tastes. When somebody, and I know you're familiar with it, somebody posts a poem on Facebook or some other short story on say Instagram, or even a poetic form on Instagram, how do you judge the quality of literary works online? What qualifies as a quality work? Is there, and I know in recent times you've been thinking about the canon and the politics of canon formation, and I wonder what you think about that when that kind of question comes up.
People ask that questions because as human beings, we be conditioned to think about the traditional way of in which we make decision on what is aesthetically pleasing or what is aesthetically good, which, as you said, is linked to canon formation. But I think what people need to realize, or what I've realized, is that the audience knows how to make judgment about this thing. What qualifies a good poetry is, you can see that in people's reactions, whether through the use of emoji or whether through what is written down as comments, as a response, or the kind of debate that follows such postings. And I think this was Frank Moretti. He was saying that when new forms emerge, we often fail to notice it because we are so preoccupied with the traditional notion of reading text, with the traditional notion of engaging with text, in which we think that an editor has to intervene first, or literary journalists have to tell us this is an important work of art, this is an important work of literature, before we deem them as an important work of literature. But then we need to ask questions. This is what I was trying to get at back in the book, the idea of representations. Who's representing this notion of taste? Whose taste are we buying into? Is it the taste of a middle-class editor based in London, or the taste of somebody sitting in their sitting room in Lagos or in Nairobi?
Mm. Thank you so much. That's quite provocative. I don't know if Dr. Musila's audio piece is working now. If we could go back to her.
I don't know whether she wants to put something in chat.
Yeah.
And then we can just communicate through chat.
I think she's trying to set up another device. Yes, we can still hear you, Grace.
Or if people have questions, they can put it in chat as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Shola, do you want to talk about the digital divide, the rhetoric of the digital divide, and the way it is sometimes mobilized to obscure forms of African agency online? At times I imagine that people are so obsessed with the digital divide in Africa, and I acknowledge that it does exist, but at times I get a sense that it could be used to obscure the work of the digitally connected, if that makes sense. You're theorizing about those who are connected using literary works, literary forms to circulate different forms of representations. But the literature, when it comes to digital discourses in Africa, seems to sometimes be fixated on the idea of the digital divide. I don't know what to make of that.
I mean, that is a digital divide when it comes to literary studies. I think, but when it comes to popular culture, I think that divide is being bridged anyway. But we got to literature, there's still a digital divide. And why is that this divide? That divide is a carryover from the print age, in which the language of literature is still mainly English, French, Portuguese. And if we face the reality, this then exclude a significant part of the population from having that kind of conversation about literature. And this then carry over. And this is also even become more problematic when given that those who have constant access to the internet may be able to have a more deeper or life enriching engagement with literature compared to those who have less resources to spend on data. As I said, I think it was one presentation that I had not long ago. If you look at Nigeria, for example, I was spending about 6,000 naira per month on data. That is half the salary of somebody's outside. That is whereas a petrol station worker in Lagos gets 12,000 naira per month. So how do we expect such a person to engage in literary discussions the same way that somebody like you and I will? So there's still digital divide with regards to literary study. But I think where we see a much more robust engagement is in popular culture, especially with regard to music, with regard to comedy, and in the area that you are well familiar with.
So thanks, Shola. That's really helpful. Dr. Musila has a question here, which I think is really good. So like you suggested, we'll just do this through chatting until she's able to connect. You briefly touched on the question of digital celebrity in your book. What are your thoughts on what it enables or undermines in literary production broadly, and particularly regarding African literary production and circulation?
I think what it enables, and it's a way which also is a negativity, is that it creates a culture of canons. It's already created. We already have canons, and we already have those that are deemed as the real cultural ambassadors. So we have a few people or a handful of people who go around the world talking about Africa, representing Africa to the rest of the world. Whereas there are also hundreds, if not thousands, of writers whose work are equally good, arguably anyway, but who are not getting attention. And also, what you realize is that the work that gain attention within digital space end up becoming being published by noted writers. This has been happening for the past 10 or 15 years or so. So we see a process in which the gatekeeping, the way in which the idea of gatekeeping was challenged by the arrival of the digital age. That culture of creating gatekeeper is now crossing over to what is being published digitally as well.
Thank you so much, Shola. Can you hear me this time around?
Yes, that's good.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Apologies for the, clearly I'm not a proper digital native, as Prof. Yeku calls it, so I must try and gain full entry to the digital nation, as it were. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, first of all, to Prof. Yeku and the entire team behind the Digital Indaba for convening this platform and for having us today and for inviting me to be part of it. And a big thank you to you, Shola, for this wonderful book, which is just an absolute pleasure read, and I'm really excited that it's out and that we get to enjoy it and we get to bounce ideas with you, not just as somebody who's interested in the developments in digital literature, African digital literary patterns of production, circulation, distribution, but also it's a particularly special book to me because it's a sister book. For those who don't know, Shola's book is published under the African Articulation series, which is part of the Boydell and Brewer stable. And my book is also part of that stable. So it's really exciting to be able to receive this book and bounce ideas around it. And lastly, just to be welcomed into the network of the colleagues doing exciting work on digital African literature and digital African popular culture. Apart from Shola and Prof. Yeku here, we've got the work of people like Stephanie Bosch Santana, the works of people like Katie Haynes, people like Doslin Kiguro, and a whole range of people like Dina Ligaga. So it's a really exciting and really vibrant community of work that, and I'm really excited to see it grow as it shapes up. So a big thank you for that. So since we've lost quite a bit of time to my digital non-citizenship, I think I'll just jump into a couple of questions that came to mind for me, and maybe we can think together around them, and then we can move on to the next part of the conversation. So, Shola, I was intrigued by your discussion about the ways in which cyberspace functions as a debut platform for a subsequent transition to print. And you compare it to the ways in which performance artists test out their work in live performance before proceeding to print or recording in the case of music. And so as far as you're concerned, then cyberspace serves as a test bed for work that may later go into print. And I think in this regard, you're also in conversation with Yeku's work and his concept of the tyranny of print. And I wondered whether you could speak a bit about that and what exactly is at play there in terms of this testing. Is the testing around marketability and resonance with publics, or is it also around a collective crafting as we go along, or is it a mix of both? So I wonder whether you could talk to that, but also related to that, if you could comment a bit on the persistence of this tyranny of print, as Yeku calls it. Well, how do you understand that in African literature?
Thank you. I think I will address the idea of the tyranny of print. If you notice in the book, with regards to literary networks, I use an example of a short story published by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called Jumping Monkey. Jumping Monkey actually, in my view, embodies the character in Jumping Monkey. That's a character called Edo Kambo. Edo Kambo was or is an English professor who seems all too powerful in the world of African literature. And what Edo Kambo did in this particular short story is to invite promising African literary voices from the main capitals, from Dhaka, from Lagos, from Nairobi, from all over the continent, to come to a place in South Africa and talk about their work and discuss their work. And everybody in this workshop were quite afraid of Edward because, as they said, this guy is able to get them a contract in London, a publishing contract. It's not somebody that you must, is somebody you must not antagonize. And this story speaks to the tyranny of print, in which you have powerful figures in literary networks who determines what is aesthetically good enough to be published, what people are going to be reading, what publishers, what bookshops are going to be selling, and what schools are going to be reading. So I use this particular short story to address the tyranny of print, especially with regard to African literature. The other questions you were asking, what's the first question you asked was, can you hear me? Great.
Yes, I can hear you.
Your first question, what's your question again?
So in a way, you've actually answered it, because I was interested in the tyranny of print in relation to the ways in which the online platform functions as what you call a debut platform to transition onto publication.
Digital being a text.
So I was in, yes.
The digital platform being a text bed from what I think that idea as expressed in the book was one of those, you know what I said about books having so many stories. They were this kind of sort of story that were emerging in around 2010, 2012, where we have bloggers whose work were bought by publishers in the West and turned into books. But since then, between now and then, we have work that were just published online in the digital space, where a digital magazine or even on Lista, and have remained online. So this work, in a way, prioritized that kind of idea I was expressing about the digital being a test bed. I think in some cases it is, but not in all cases, because we now have so many publications that actually pay good, decent money for your story to be published online and to remain online.
So I think I just found that so intriguing, because in many senses, you're really helping us tease out the money side of literary production, which African literary discourse has tended to be very, shall we say, shy about engaging with, the question of the money side of it. And we understand why, because the earlier generations of African writing were very much invested in a particular political project. Then soon after that, you've got that Cold War moment, and you've got this deep immersion into a very Marxist sensibility that I think we're still very much attached to, even though we have, there've been certain shifts around that. But still then, on money questions, and particularly on your first category in the work, the question of class. And it seems to me that class is a very thorny issue in the material that you're exploring, and as you unpack it in the book, but also it seems to play out also in the digital platforms that you're writing about, where, and this is the bit that really intrigued me, you talk about how many of the writers that you were looking at felt very strongly about pushing back against stereotypical portraits of Africans, but in the process, they end up swinging to the other extreme end and ending up with, again, the sort of the classical single story, you know, the Adichie classical single story, which you say it continues to haunt digital African literature. And I wondered about your thoughts around this single story and the extent to which it's a product of the self-reflexive turn that is encouraged by social media platforms, which seem to very much have a strong, very strong investment in the self, and it's more in modes of self-staging and self-articulation and self-representation. So I was curious about that interaction between social media platforms as a key is a key intervention in literary production, in the landscape of literary production, and its conventions on one hand, and its conventions around self-presentation and self-projection, but also the ways in which then that leaks onto the kind of writing that this range of writers you're exploring opt for, which tends to be very inward looking and very, as is very inward looking, but in the process, is it possible to understand this single story as not just a product of who is telling these stories, but also a product of this scenario, this turn to the self, encouraged by these digital platforms and genres?
Thank you. I think with regards to the problems, I think that was an article that I was engaging with at the start of the project. And that article said the problem of Africa is the problem of image. And of course, in order to address this image, these writers, they went on to portray their own version of Africa, which is based on the kind of social interactions that they were having, the kind of intellectual experience and cultural experience that they were having, and the kind of intellectual association and cultural association as well that they were having. And these have a way, our experience of the world, our lived experience, have a way of seeping on to fiction, to fictional narratives. So you have a gay writer, somebody writing about queer character, or gay character, or lesbian characters, putting these characters in very middle class space, in going to London, going to New York, drinking cappuccino, eating organic tofu. There's some such a thing as organic tofu anyway. So in which the world of the fictional characters then relieving the world of the writers, because the writer is preoccupied. I mean, I know preoccupied is a very strong word, with portraying their own Africanness, their own fashion of Africanness. And what it tends to do then is, in order to portray your own fashion of Africa, you then tend to overlook the other Africa, the other African experience, which might be the experience of the majority, who might not be able to afford to drink organic latte or go to London or New York, or who might not have access to the kind of digital platforms that the digital connected writers and readers may have access to. Because out of sight is also out of mind, then you end up creating characters that in a way you recreate the single story that the middle class or the upper middle class African writers are campaigning against. And this kind of thing, this sort of questioning of the idea of authenticity with regards to who is speaking for Africans is what I was trying to signpost us to in the book.
And I think, so for me that stayed with me partly because, and I think it ties into your section on the quotidian and your discussion about how a lot of these writers are turning from the pressures of the big questions that earlier writers were very much preoccupied with and turning towards the quotidian. And I found myself, and this was my sense while reading, I found myself struggling with the question of what are the big questions of the present? What are the big questions of the period within which these writers are writing? And in what ways do they then mobilize or articulate these questions via this preoccupation with the quotidian? And I fully sympathize with and understood exactly where they're coming from in relation to this concern with producing different images of Africa and African experiences and African subjectivities. But at the same time, for me, it's precisely at the level of class and the level of just the triumph of the neoliberal project on the continent that I found these writers in a way, confronted with a blind spot of sorts, because here they are fighting the demon of stereotyping of the continent under the trinity of poverty, disease, war, poverty, disease, and understandably, but simultaneously in the process of confronting that with these quotidian images of having coffee and a beautiful photograph of having coffee and cake, or going out with friends at marketplaces in Lagos or in Nairobi, but of what we end up with is a performance of a full-scale and seemingly uncritical embrace of the neoliberal project on the continent. So beyond the problem of the single storyness of this work is a larger crisis of the ongoing production of a neoliberal subjectivities that, of course, again, and inevitably they're very nicely plugged into, and the digital platforms seem to facilitate this. So I was just, I wrestled with that quite a bit, but I just wanted to ask, so I've got a whole lot of other questions, but I'm aware that colleagues and participants might want to ask.
No, it's a very good point you've raised. The question is, as you said, what is the present conjuncture? What is the present condition that we should be focusing on? Is it the question of image, or the question of us communicating within ourselves, between ourselves? What is more important? And I think this is one of the dangers of this notion of Afropolitanism, in which we have a set of people, the so-called Afropolitans, who spans these neoliberal spaces on the continent of Africa and other continents in Europe and the Americas, who thinks that they fit in between the two worlds and they can relate and connect within those two worlds. And in the process, forget that there are millions of others who cannot just walk into the American embassy and ask for visa, or walk to the British embassy and ask for a visa, or even who cannot even afford the price for a passport, in order to actually apply for that visa, or even the price of a visa, or a visa application as well. And this has a tendency of seeping as well into literary fiction, to fictional narratives, and also into what people post on social media platforms as well. This preoccupation in projecting their own self, as you said, this idea of self, we live in the age of self-presentation, in which people go online every day and say, this is what I'm having for breakfast. This I'm spending my weekend. This my beauty with these are my beauty with children, and this is my beauty with husband, or with boyfriend, girlfriend. This is the life that I'm living. And even now on Nigerian social media, what was trending today was what they call Japa. And Japa is, I'm going abroad. I'm leaving you guys behind. So this was trending on Twitter today. People with their pictures on Japan and hashtag Japa on Twitter, like, I'm escaping this sort of hello and I'm moving, to another space. And these ideas are not coming out of a vacuum. They are coming out of what people are saying in writings, what people are seeing on those they look up to as cultural ambassadors. They've seen their lifestyle and they want to emulate their lifestyle. This is why literature matters, or literature reflects lived experience. Literature reflects these conditions, and it speaks to these conditions, and people aspire to what they read in literature and what they see. And also, you notice now that the life of the writer is out there. Unlike before, we don't know when, in the age of the Ngugis, in the age of the Soyinkas and Achebe, the personal life of the writer was far removed from the public life. So that the public life and the private life of the writer. But now, both, it's a very thin line separating the two. And even at times, there are no lines at all. And this sort of curates this notion of separation from reality, for the lived experience of the majority of the people.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, in a way that and at the risk of obsessing about this Marxist question, I think part of our crisis on the continent has been that once the Marxist theoretical approach fell short of some of the questions that were being tabled, I think we haven't been able to put on the table or articulate another frame that could speak to a collective project and usefully confront just the assaults of the neoliberal project across the world, not just on the continent, but on the continent, of course, it plays out very tragically in terms of just literal exclusions from the basics of what it means to be human. And I think that's part of why then it becomes very troubling when so much of our energy is invested in showcasing consumption and crafting identities that are very much tied to processes of consumption. But maybe my last comment, and then I'm curious to hear what other colleagues have to say, and just the kinds of questions they might put on the table. I think for me, I was intrigued by how, in a way, your project traces the developments of African digital literary imagination right from the moment of listservs, which I don't know if everybody in the room is old enough to remember listservs, all the way to now when we're talking blogs and all this and all these dynamics. And one of the interesting things that your book does then is to do the swing back and forth between the digital and the offline world, and to track the kinds of exchanges that are happening in these literary networks between the digital networks and the sort of offline worlds, or what I think Stephanie Bosch-Santana, following Stephanie Newell, talks about as paravirtual networks, those shifts back and forth. So I think I really found that rich and just exciting to think with. And then the other thing that totally intrigued me was your argument that digital platforms and the genres, the accompanying genres, facilitate a certain reprise of pre-print culture genres and practices. And I think that's something that's just bound to really resonate for many people, because many of us think about digital platforms and the digital imagination as very much about contemporary forms and contemporary experiences. So when you talk about poets tapping into the genealogies of the Oriki, for instance, or when you talk about African erotic writing as not necessarily a new phenomenon, but actually in a way as a throwback to earlier cultural modes of the erotic. And of course, what comes to mind then for me is to ask myself, so what is it about the digital that's more receptive to African erotic textualities in ways that print, at least, what is it about the digital in this moment, in the sense of the last 2 or 3 decades, that has been receptive to African erotic narratives in ways that the earlier decades were not receptive? Because I think, again, for people of my generation and earlier, when one thought of the erotic, one had to look to imported so-called trash fiction and trash magazines. Again, those of us who are old enough to remember Playboy, James Hadley Chase, and those sorts of things. So there seems to be something about the moment of the last 3 decades, as well as the digital, that opens up space for this retrieval of indigenous erotic cultures and reinsertion into circulation. And then just the last thing for me was speculating about how the picture changes around class when we, and I've raised this with you previously, how the picture changes around class when we look at WhatsApp and narratives circulated on WhatsApp. And for those of us in family WhatsApp groups, you will have received all those forwards and all those re-updatings of particular morality tales. So we see the resurgence of the morality tale, but those seem to circulate within a very particular class network. And in fact, those same members of those networks would then turn up on Twitter, which seems to be on the hierarchy of platforms, seems to be apparently more sophisticated. And they would turn up on Twitter and in a way mock the family WhatsApp group about all these stories that are circulating there. But it just occurs to me that probably the class question gets disrupted a bit on those platforms, because the working classes and similar communities seem to be more active in those platforms and seem to be, diving into the imaginative creativity in those platforms, which seem to demand different kinds of literacies. And I'm not talking literacies in the sense of English reading and writing, but just literacies in terms of taste, in terms of narrative. They seem to demand different kinds of literacies from the literacies demanded by a blog, for instance. But anyway, so those are just comments I'm throwing on the table. And I think I'll hand back to our chair. And here, I don't hog all the time, but yeah, let's. I'm wondering whether should we hear what other questions coming from the floor. But thank you so much, Shola.
Thanks, Grace. It's that's very interesting points and very important point that you've raised. I think with regards to the kind of explicitness that we see in digital platform as compared to the world of books, I think we need to look at the history, the formation of print network in Nigeria or in Kenya or even in other African countries. Remember, the print network came with the missionary. The printing press came with the missionary, and the objective was to create this mini version of the European, the Christian, the obedient Christians who only have sex for procreation, and any form of profanity, or sexual explicitness is frowned upon. And so the idea of the book on the continent came from this, and that history has impacted on what we read and what we publish ever since. Whereas with the digital, we're able to incorporate those elements of our oral traditions, in which the idea of profanity and the idea of the sexually explicit is not seen as being a taboo, in which the sexually explicit is sung openly when at the right time, not all the time, at the right time, within the right atmosphere, and people embrace it. And what we now have is the ability to bring back this culture and incorporate it. I think one thing we also need to take note that the idea of separating oral tradition from digital tradition is one thing that we must rethink. I think we see the digital as the next stage of the African text. That oral tradition is the next stage. It's not that the African oral tradition stopped. It still lives, and it will still live after whatever platform we're engaging with now. So what it does is it adapts itself to this new digital age and make use of all these elements. The beauty of African text is the ability to adapt, the flexibility, the malleability of embracing new ideas and new culture. And here we might also want to think about what Abiodun Roland talked about. He gave an example of how culture in Africa is not static. And he used the word Asha. In Yoruba, Asha is culture. Asha is also trend. So Asha is culture, tradition, but it's also current trend, current fashion. So in which we need to see culture as our oral culture as always as a living thing that's able to take on new developments. And I think digital technology is that. Whereas the book age was a bit restrictive. Of what we're seeing in the book here is a bit restrictive because of the politics that comes with colonial publishing, also the politics that came with post-colonial publishing as well.
Just as you're speaking, sorry, last one, Yeku, then I'll hand back to you. But when you say about the digital as the next stage of the oral, you just got me thinking about my own engagement with digital platforms and the ways in which the so-called Black Twitter, for instance, or just Black digital texts tend to be very oral in the sense of AURAL, in the sense of the full comprehension of a lot of that text demands that one is plugged into how the word sounds when it is said, and even how it is said, even though one is talking about text. So I think in that regard, just as you're saying that, it really sort of clicked for me that how I personally consume digital content is very different from how I consume sort of canonical or any sort of print material, because print material does not make those demands of me around paying attention to sound and literally envisioning how words come together as spoken words. So, but thank you so much. And I'll hand back to our chair. Sorry, we've been naughty panelists going off and locking out everybody else, but thank you very much, Shola.
No, my pleasure. Thank you too. Thank you very much, Musila. Great. Sorry.
No, thank you both for an illuminating conversation. It's always lovely to see how scholarship then just takes all kinds of lives and forms as people discuss them and engage with them. And you see where these ideas that are put in a book can go depending on discussions. I apologize, my internet was a bit spotty then. My son also came in, so I didn't follow parts of it, but I love the larger conversation that was going on. So we don't have too much time, so the audience is very welcome to join in at this point. Type in a question or raise your hand if necessary. I am here to moderate the session for the next 15 minutes or so. So please join in with a question. You can raise your hand or you can type based on the little you have heard, or if you have had the privilege of reading the text before, or you have listened to Dr. Adenekan's presentations in the past. He's been working on this for a while, and you can see the amount of work that has gone into the groundbreaking text that is the source of this discussion. So, so far there's some praise from Peter Moritz. We are happy to hear questions. But before the questions come in, I think the discussion was really going well, so we can continue with it. I love the question of how the digital plays with the oral and the print as well, because we tend to think of one as replacing the other, but that's not the case, right? Because I mean, the print didn't replace the oral simply and the print simply engaged in complex ways. In the same way to the digital just brings in a new form of technology. After all, there's oral technology and there's print technology, and now there's digital technology. So it's just different forms that are coalescing together in all kinds of complex ways. Of course, they compete every now and then, but in the end, they're existing together. There's a coexistence of sorts, which I think it's interesting to hear how Shola is theorizing on all of that. And I mean, that's where the discussion ended before we sort of transition. So I don't mind personally if you continue with that until we get people join in with questions.
Thank you. And I'm going to continue thank you, Corbina, with what Grace was saying about WhatsApp family group and how that then translates to other social media platforms. And I think we need to think about this kind of adaptability of the text, in which what is said in WhatsApp group might be more explicit than what is then published on other social media platforms, in which people adapt the text so to suit different social media platforms, which in a way is also similar to the kind of adaptation that people were doing with tests in the past. You know, when a singer or a musician would go to a village or a city or a town, sing the same song, but maybe to different audience, remove certain material from the text to suit that audience. And this kind of robustness that one tends to see within digital platforms that is missing with the book, because to change a book cannot be, you know, it's impossible to be changing books all the time, or if it's possible, it's quite expensive to do. And also, what I said previously about recognizing the history of the book on the continent, how it came about, and the project behind it, and how that project, the legacy of that project, the Colonial Modernity Project, still pervades our experience of the book up to date.
And you know something, I think there's also something there about the different forms of self-consciousness that are at play for different platforms of creativity. And that self-consciousness then goes hand in hand with questions of publics and addressivity. So that on certain platforms, there's a certain awareness of addressing, in a way, multiple publics, but ultimately, when we get to those multiple publics, then we get into these scenarios of very self-conscious self-staging, which seems to be part of what's happening with a lot of the African digital literatures on blogs, sort of going upwards, if I can impose a hierarchy, compared to just slightly different kinds of self-consciousnesses that are at play with the forms of creativity that emerge on WhatsApp groups, where there are certain intimacies at play. And the intimacies of a WhatsApp group, for instance, are very different from the intimacies of an Instagram post, where one is aware of a larger public and therefore different expectations about how you must present yourself, and in a way, and the kinds of publics that are being imagined at these different levels. But also, I think it goes hand in hand with something, and at the risk of being very essentialist here, but the part of the pressures of colonial modernity for Africans has been the pressure of being multilingual. And multilingual, not just in the sense of speaking English, Portuguese, French, and all that, but multilingual in the sense of mastering different cultural literacies and knowing when to activate which one, right? So, and I think and it's not even about whether or not you speak an African language. It's just about the cultural literacies that are demanded by different contexts. And I suppose this happens with all communities across the world, but I think it's very sharp and distinct with African communities, partly because of our lengthy, but also still ongoing immersion into worlds in which we never fully citizens, but also we never fully relocate there. So we have these migratory subjectivities, to misquote Carol Boyce Davis, but these migratory subjectivities across cultural landscapes that then come with the different literacies that we know when to activate which literacy at what point. And ultimately then when it comes to creative and imaginative work, then I imagine that kicks in as well. And it kicks in terms of who are we imagining as our public at any given moment, and what versions of ourselves are we wanting to craft for that imagined public. But I could be in very essentialist waters here, so I wonder what folks think.
It's the code switching in terms of culture is something that I think most Africans are used to, and it's quite interesting that, like, I've had this discussion with my students before, and sometimes they take it for granted so much that they're not even willing to confront it until it is situated in certain contexts. So no, I agree fully that something that goes on, like the cultural caste problem that Senghor also talked about, it resonates with that kind of discussion. And so I find it very helpful. So we are honored by everyone whose presence is here, but I see Oyeronke Oyewumi, Prof. Shola has mentioned you several times in very, very glowing terms, and I wanted to know if you had any comments for as you were here, just to call you out very quickly. Prof. Oyewumi, in different spaces, Shola has really been very grateful to. Yeah, okay, I think she's already typed, okay. Says that it's a brilliant and enlightening discussion and she can't wait to read the books. Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
Hello. I was already typing that discussion.
As if I knew.
I was, because I'm just so mesmerized by the brilliance. I mean, Grace's questions and Shola's responses. I could sit here and watch them for the next 10 hours. And I'm learning a lot, because I'm actually thinking of various things. I mean, as you know, I'm a gender scholar, and I haven't looked at either of the books. But one of the things that really riles me, and I don't know, Shola, whether you've attended to that, the WhatsApps that I get on some of this Nigerian fora, they're just simply misogynistic.
Oh, true.
There's a lot of misogyny in the form of terrible jokes, and we're all supposed to be laughing at it. And the extent of the male dominance and for me, I would say new norms that have been created about men just being the human and the rest of us just don't matter. I'm just totally blown away by it. And so I don't know whether your book touches on some of that. You were talking about Ashewo, and I'm glad that you finally educated people about the origin of the term, because it's quite an African term, West African term, and people say Ashawo, and I say, yeah, but the original is Ashawo, money changer and all that. So I'm quite excited about your book, but I've just been concerned about the male dominance and the way in which social media, I guess everywhere, facilitates that. It makes our work of transformation very difficult. I'm a sociologist, not a literary person, so forgive me, but those are some of the thoughts on my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oyewumi. The points you raised about WhatsApp is very valid. And I think this way we need to think about spaces, how different spaces allow different ideas. And I think WhatsApp is because it's a very closed space, people feel that they have the freedom, the license, so to say, to be anti-women, to be homophobic, in a way that they wouldn't be able to express such rabid ideas in other social media platforms. I think maybe kind of an intimacy that Grace was referring to, because they feel they are talking to younger brothers, or they are, so they are trying to, it's a way of recreating the community. It's kind of like family circle. You understand? I'm talking to my family. So, and I can say what I like because I'm the elder or I'm the man in this family. That kind of old notions of patriarchy is finding its way into WhatsApp as a platform. I've encountered that a lot. And also you get graphic images. And also you have these didactic messages all the time, talking about morals, what constitutes a good morals, right? If you live your life this way a good woman should behave, this way a responsible young man should behave. If you do this, you go to university. If you do this, you get a wife. This is how you get a husband. This is how you live your life and make money. And I think maybe the kind of intimate, what Grace was referring to, the kind of communal nature of WhatsApp, maybe that's what allows that to happen. I don't know what if Grace had anything to say about that as well.
I think, and thank you so much, Prof. Ayumi, for joining us and for that question, which is so on point, because I think it also speaks to something that the book talks to, which is just cautioning about our assumptions that digital platforms are necessarily more progressive, because they're not. There's a lot of, and I think everybody knows that, but somehow we still hold on to this fantasy of the digital as necessarily more, so we hold on to this fantasy of the digital as necessarily more progressive, when in reality, the very intense forms of conservatism in the digital platforms, and not only in relation to gender, but when it comes to gender, so for me, that question, firstly, just the Shola discussion reminds me of the slay queen trope, which seems to be the sort of the digital updating of that same figure. And it seems to emerge in moments when women are taking up space. Because I was reading, I think it's called A.L. Epstein, and he's done some work on the copper belt in Zambia. And he did a linguistic, it's got a classic paper on language innovation in the copper belt in Zambia in the 50s. And there he talks about the term ama champion. And ama champion, he says, is a word that references dancing championships in the ballroom dancing competitions that were being held in Zambia at the time, but also it ended up being used to reference either a smartly dressed woman or a woman of loose morals. And so we can see the resonances there with the figure of the slay queen, which seems to be this term that's used for a stylish modern woman, but simultaneously it has these sexual overtones. But part of what's going on here, it seems to be, and this is something that I think people like Christine Obo, people like the historian Tabitha Kanogo, and people like Stephanie Newell as well have spoken about, when in moments of intense crisis, there's always a turn to women. So for instance, in the 70s, when post-independent African states were going through their meltdowns, you had this intense focus on women and anxieties about women's morality, about women being loose, about this problem of women. And each of these scholars suggests that part of what's happening there is that people displace concerns about larger crisis, which they feel overwhelmed by and unable to control. They displace them onto the bodies of women, because there's this, again, assumption, or once again, another fantasy that you can at least control women. And we seem to be going through that moment again. And those conservative perspectives are all over the place. That on Twitter, you would, as you scroll down a timeline, you would have 3-4 tweets which are very progressive about gender logics, and then you bump into another one which is immensely popular and it's got really problematic gender logics going on. And part of all this seems to be, once again, yet another moment of anxiety about policing women's presence and women's ownership of their sexuality, of their bodies, of their minds, by reducing it to their sexuality, then reducing it further to morality. So suddenly there's this resurgence of very simplistic moral narratives, and it seems to be a way of deflecting our attention from the reality of just the other forms of paralysis that we are faced with around the political landscapes right across the continent, where there really isn't a clear agenda of what now, how do we get out of this? So women have always been these very useful and handy place that we can turn to and displace our anxieties around, and in the hope that we can at least control them. But yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of really, really just horrendous gender logics unfolding in all these platforms.
Okay, so thank you so much. And that was a very good sort of thread to follow. We are out of time, and I want to thank everyone for making the time to participate in this very, very well organized talk. We have to thank Dr. James Eku and Brian Rosenbaum and everybody at University of Kansas for the work that they've done. But most especially, I want to thank Shola and Grace for gracing us with this. Pardon the pun, I'm a terrible interpreter, but thank you so much for this wonderful session. We've learned a lot. It's been very enlightening, and we hope that these conversations continue in such spaces and outside of such spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Oga Shola. Thank you so much, Professor Musila. You should probably write the forward to my book, if forwards are possible. The social media analysis are just so nice. I like the way you differentiate between the platforms. It's really neat. People tend to group them together and just discuss them in general terms, but the different hierarchies and intimacies and publics they convoke, I love the way you capture that. When I heard that, I was like, you should come and write the forward to my book. Thanks so very much.
Thank you so much.
It's still recording, really.
No, thanks so much for